Hello there, people of the internet. Today, I am out here at the gun range. Well, the old retro gun range. I'm out here today because I had a conversation with actually another YouTube creator, and we were discussing some of the reasons why lever actions were so gosh darn mainstream in the civilian market here in the United States. Real quick, sorry for the interruption, but I'm trying to get Patreon and Utreon supports to assist me with making more content like what you're watching right here. So if you want to help me make more content and make it more often, then Utreon and Patreon links are in the description below. Obviously, the things I'm doing here are not free, and much of it is not cheap. So I would like to be able to do more, but I need support to do it. So like I said, links below. Now, a lot of times in the civilian market, we see firearms go mainstream if they're adopted by United States military, but there was never any significant official adoption of any sort of lever action by the military forces. Of course, it was used in the military depending on who it was that was using it. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Kevin is my peacock. I got 4 of them. They like making noise. Of course, these were used in military service here in the United States, depending on who was using it, whether or not they supplied it themselves, but it was not officially adopted by any United States military force in any real significant quantities. I imagine the Confederate forces during the Civil War may have adopted a few of these just because they were trying to get their hands on absolutely everything, but as for any large-scale adoption, lever actions were not adopted. And yet, they were very prevalent in the hands of civilian ownership across the United States, and I'd like to go ahead and talk about that. I get asked pretty regularly, why were these so influential in the civilian population, whereas, you know, nobody ever went for the bolt actions, or, I mean, these were way more popular in U.S. civilian ownership than bolt actions, or semi-automatics, or pump actions, or anything like that for a very, very long time. I covered the actual history behind the lever action in a previous video, and I covered it very, very well. I recommend that you guys go ahead and go look at that. I will try to remember linking that down in the description below. If I forget about that, somebody in the comments let me know that I forgot about that. But the lever action, the original design based off of the volcanic, we're gonna skip the volcanic, you know, history and whatnot, just go right to the lever action. Lever action, originally designed by Henry in 1860. That was whenever the 44 Henry rimfire came out. It was revolutionary. At the time, people were using, this was before smokeless powder had come out, people were still using black powder. Muzzle loaders were a very clear and common thing during this time period. And to have a firearm that you could have multiple cartridges just load right into a tubular magazine and sit there and bang, 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 you know, until you're out of ammunition, as opposed to one-shot fire, have to, you know, load your muzzle loader from the muzzle there and cap it separately, and it's just a far slower and more irritating process. People tried getting their hands on lever actions whenever they could, whenever it was possible. In 1860, there were some bolt action designs, but not very many. There were some needle fire designs that were bolt action, but they were single shots. Bolt actions were more like breech loading muzzle loaders at that time period. Cartridge technology has not really progressed to the point to where centerfire cartridges were really a mainstream thing. This did come later on, but whenever 1860 rolled around and the lever action came out, muzzle loaders and breech loaders and things like that just weren't all that capable of having any sort of real magazine system in them at the time, based on the cartridges that they were firing, or the paper cartridges that they were firing, or the needle fire systems that they utilized. Technology just was not quite there. They certainly weren't using the bolt action designs that we know nowadays. Now, bolt action technology would very rapidly progress and advance in not a lot of time. But within the course of, you know, not a lot of time, I'm talking several decades have passed. And since that happened, you know, centerfire technology has been adopted for this thing. There were several millions of these already made and being used in the civilian population, because at the time of its creation, bolt actions and semi-automatics did not, well, bolt actions were not that great. Semi-automatics simply did not exist because smokeless powder did not exist. Pump action rifles were conceptually there, but they did not catch on like the lever action. They just did not have the following that the lever action did. They didn't come out in time to compete with the lever action. There's a lot of things going on with pump action rifles. I actually have an example right here. This right here is a Remington Model 14, which came out some 40 years after the 1860 Henry came out. This was Remington's attempt to compete with the lever action design. It is simply a pump action rifle as opposed to a lever action rifle. Just as soon as I can, there we go. A pump action rifle as opposed to a lever action rifle. There's no real advantage to one or the other. The lever action rifle just had like half a century of adoption time that it had been able to experience before this right here was even conceptually a thing, honestly. For the time period that the lever action came out, meaning the 1860 Henry and what everybody else was rocking at the time, it really was revolutionary technology for the time period. It would not stay revolutionary technology, but by the time, you know, technology for the bolt action rifles and whatnot really started to pick up, or by the time that semi-automatics really began to develop, there's a bug on my camera. Excuse me, sir. Could you get off of there? But by the time these different platforms came out and started really utilizing what these platforms could really become, there were already several millions of these in the hands of United States citizens, and they were using them very, very effectively. It was a known working platform. There were all sorts of different variations. You could get these very plentifully and very literally anywhere. It wasn't until the adoption of repeating bolt action rifles by military use that we started to really see these fall out of favor. Of course, lever action rifles are still very much predominant here in the United States even to this day, but they're not near as common or predominant as they used to be. Bolt action rifles, they became more mainstream simply because the United States military was adopting it. I'm not going to get into why they adopted bolt actions as opposed to a lever action. I'm not going to get into the issues with tube-fed magazines as opposed to box magazines. We're strictly talking about why these right here were so predominant. Once bolt actions became adopted in the U.S. military, then everybody who had served in the U.S. military wanted the rifle that they were familiar with. People began to see just how good of these rifles, you know, how good these rifles actually were. The Krag Jorgensen was kind of the feeding system was not great, so people still kind of leaned toward the lever actions just because of how finicky the Krag Jorgensen system could be. But once the 1903 and the 1906 hit, and people were starting to really move away from the black powder more to the smokeless powder cartridges, the lever actions began to go out of favor. In 1894, whenever the 30-30 was introduced in the smokeless powder round, people were, of course, still using black powder rounds because there were millions of these chambered in black powder rounds. But smokeless powder was becoming more and more predominant over the United States as people began to see and understand just how useful and effective the smokeless powder actually was. Eventually, they, you know, left behind the old black powder rifles and adopted the new smokeless powder rifles, and then eventually they left behind the old lever action design that they've been rocking for, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. They ended up, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Swapping over to bolt actions, there's a lot of pros and cons with that. The main reason why a lot of people went over to these bolt action rifles was because Spitzer bullets were starting to really become a thing. And you don't want to load pointed bullets into a tubular fed magazine, because whenever you have a pointed bullet up against the primer of the cartridge in front of it, you really risk chain detonation inside of your magazine, and that would be a very, very bad time. Bolt actions at the time had a really good system with a box magazine where the rounds were not placed right on top of, you know, the head of one round was not placed along the nose of the cartridge in front of it. I don't know what the hell that sentence was. The bullet of the cartridge behind the one in front of it is not pressed against the primer of that cartridge. There. That's what I was trying to say. Spitzer cartridges were shown to be much more aerodynamically capable, much more ballistically capable. You could touch out to way further distances with cartridges like that, as opposed to the more round lead rounds that these lever actions were more used to using. Now, ironic as it is, this pump action rifle right here, Originally, Remington was going to go with a semi-automatic rifle, and they actually tried that, but the United States civilian population just was not ready for semi-automatics at the time, and semi-automatics did not seem to sell very well. I'm willing to bet that the semi-automatics of that time period were overly complicated and difficult to maintain, difficult to clean. I bet that they were very finicky. I bet there's a lot of issues that goes into dealing with semi-automatics of that time period. I wouldn't know. I live in this time period. But I'm willing to bet that semi-automatics just were not that great at that time. So that's why they went over to this bolt-action rifle, or not bolt-action, this pump-action rifle, trying to compete with the lever actions. So the lever actions just had way too much of a foothold already in American society. So lots that we just covered in this video in a pretty short amount of time. We covered like a century of American history in not a lot of time. But hopefully you guys at least found it entertaining and worth watching. I'm going to go ahead, make a little bit of B-roll footage so I can splice some of that in here in the video. Besides that, subscribe to the channel, like the video. Description down below has a link to all sorts of different stuff. Go ahead and go check that out. And I'm sure somebody's going to have something to add in the comments down below, so you guys go ahead and you add that down in the comments below. Whenever this came out in the 1860s and everybody was still rocking, you know, muzzle loaders and some breech loaders, but mostly muzzle loaders. During that time period, the Civil War had started here in the United States, and people tried getting their hands on as many Henrys as they absolutely possibly could, really seeing the value in just how much fire they could put down range as opposed to somebody else with a muzzle loader. And it really began to show how great these rifles were. And I feel like if the Civil War did not happen, then these rifles would not be as predominant, because there were lots of different rifle designs out there offering all sorts of different features and whatnot. And this right here definitely could have been just one of those one-offs. But with the amount of people in the Civil War armed with essentially muskets, you get yourself one guy armed with a lever-action rifle, and he was a very formidable foe on the battlefield against these other people armed with smoothbore muskets. He could single-handedly likely do quite a bit of work and damage to everything that was going on there. So I really feel like the Civil War had a lot to do with the popularity behind these. After the Civil War, like I said, a lot of these were made. Technology for the other systems just wasn't quite there yet. And these were, by the time the other technology started working itself out, millions of these had already been made, and they already had a foundation here in the United States. All right, folks, thanks for watching. I think I've talked myself out of this one. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day. I'm gonna send some lead downrange. Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.